Hello, and welcome to another Echo Punks episode. Sometimes a salon, sometimes a podcast. Today, a conversation about sponsorship. Sponsorship being the idea that if you spend money, you can put your name on something and benefit from the credibility, the spectacle, the entertainment value, the intelligence, the research, you name it. I mean, in our world, I can't think of pretty much anything that is beyond sponsorship. So, with that said, I'm joined today, of course, by Jan Lemke, my regular, and Chris Irwin, who is another Echo Punk, who I'm glad you could join us for this call. Because for me, one of the real inspirations for having this conversation was Saudi Arabia's aggressive sponsorship of sporting events, but golf in particular. And the Saudi Arabia Sovereign Fund has basically put the entire professional golf world in a state of chaos because they're attempting to buy it, to basically control it. And that has caused a bit of an existential crisis, which we can get into. But Jan, you are also someone who was interested in talking about this subject. So I'm curious to hear what you want to get into today and what you think is relevant when it comes to thinking about sponsorship.
Yeah, I thank you very much, first of all, and hi, Chris. Nice to see you again here. Um, obviously, we've all seen and heard a lot in the news over the last couple of months and years, I want to say, starting with the Football World Cup in Qatar, which was quite the media spectacle, and not only in a good way, right? Then after the World Cup, really, really well earned soccer players started to really flock from Europe to Saudi Arabia, earning incredible amounts of money. Then the golf thing happened. And then over a couple of days ago, a friend of mine who is into boxing and mixed martial arts told me about a tournament that apparently also happened over there, where an obscene amount of former heavyweight champions just posed for photo ops and were awarded 10 million, $20 million just for being there and showing up. And, obviously this looks really, really disgusting, right? Money can buy everything. And athletes, what are you thinking, right? You let, the Saudis buy your souls. But then I thought, hey, wait a minute, if the book, The History of Ethics in Sports, doesn't exist yet, it might be an interesting book to be written because it is really, really difficult when you look at sports and you look 40 years, 50 years back. I have problems pointing fingers here. Who is bad and who is worse, right? Sponsor or sponsee.
And that I think is an interesting kind of balance of responsibility, right? Who is implicated? To your point of these former athletes selling their soul, versus the other attitude is they're getting paid and they're cashing in, right? Who is responsible, the sponsor or the sponsoree? Now, Chris, I'm glad that you've joined us, so I'm going to give you the same opportunity to kind of set the agenda, as it were. What attracted you to this subject? And why don't you carry the conversation a little further in terms of what is the responsibilities of the sponsor or the sponsoree? Is there an ecosystem of responsibility when it comes to the way sponsorship now permeates not just sports, but so much of our culture and our society?
Well, Jesse, it was you that attracted me here, just to get that out of the way. So I find the topic absolutely fascinating, and I thank you for bringing in the golf reference. I think you get into these, they call them non-traditional business models, where you don't, there's not a transactional component to your service, right? Any not-for-profit, sports is this area anyway. So you have to get some funding to provide the service. Like that's just a fundamental model. And I think that the sponsorship takes the angle of people lending credibility to the cause, right? And also sort of obviously lending money to the cause. And one of the things, when you're talking about the history of sports ethics, when I was a kid, the backbone of women's professional golf was Big Tobacco. And the women's Canadian Open was the Du Maurier Classic, and it was a major. And then that is not 50 years ago, but we've come around to, if you're taking money from Big Tobacco, whoa, hold on a second. And I think that, so if you fast forward a couple of decades, I don't know, like, will money from, is it oil and gas? Is it different areas? Like, I'm not sure where these things sort of run out in terms of their credibility getting so low that it's almost an embarrassment, or it is an embarrassment to take the sponsorship. So then that support can't be above board. It has to be in ways that aren't going to garner attention, which is much harder to do in this day and age in terms of, and I think that sometimes the sources of support and sponsorship become scandalous. Like, can you believe? So it's quite, all this said, I think that's covered a whole lot of ground.
Yeah.
But I can pause there, and you can sort of, if there's any
I think
there that's interesting.
Before you chime back in, Jesse, I think, Chris, you raised a really, really important point there, which is what I would like to call the fluidity of expectations, right? You basically said, hey, what are you thinking? How can you take money from Big Tobacco? How dare you, right? On the other hand, once someone like LeBron speaks up, it's shut up and dribble, right? Or Colin Kaepernick takes a kneel and he loses his contract and is the outcast. So put yourself into the shoes of a 21, 22-year-old athlete who is told by their manager, you have to be on social media at all times. What are you even supposed to do? What are you allowed to do? What are you not allowed to do? Right. I find this is a really, really important point, Chris, that you make there. On the one hand, how dare you? On the other, how dare you not?
Well, and it also evokes a kind of ecosystem of reputation, that we assume that sponsorships are always positive, that they, transfer a kind of social capital or transfer a kind of currency, especially when you're sponsoring a champion athlete or a musical venue. But at the same time, it creates a vulnerability, which I think you're both evoking. That it's both the vulnerability of making you vulnerable to protest. I mean, I think of South Africa and the great boycotts against the South African apartheid regime that, meant that sponsorship all of a sudden became a vector for attack, right? A vector for vulnerability. And Jan, your point about kind of athletes using their star power for politics, it is a hypocrisy. Like, on the one hand, we reward stars for promoting the Saudi Arabian regime, or we reward stars for selling laundry soap. But when those same stars stand up for human rights, or when those same stars stand up for justice, somehow that's wrong.
Because this time they're not getting paid and do this out of conviction. How dare you?
Or right? I think it would be even worse if they were getting paid. Like, if Black Lives Matter was all of a sudden sponsoring Colin Kaepernick, that would have been even worse in the eyes of the NFL. But here's, the last thing I'll say is, what's interesting now is what's happening in the NHL, that the NHL has taken a really, for lack of a word, I'm going to say retro. Like, it almost seems like they're retreating. They're restricting how teams and players can customize jerseys. And the most recent controversy was a goaltender who wanted to wear an indigenous goalie mask in honor of National Indigenous Day recently. And the NHL said no, because it was against their policy of having, any politicized or any commercialized, because it goes both ways, kind of displays outside of the norm. And that has become a controversy unto itself. So I think where we've kind of gotten this to quite quickly around trust and reputation is the substance of sponsorship. And it's interesting how I think that this is relatively new, that we're talking about it in this way, versus I think for decades, it has always been a given that sponsorship was good, versus now we're starting to recognize that it is fluid, as you guys mentioned.
No, because I think, and Chris, I'll let you speak to this in a second. I think for decades, sponsorship was planned and executed as thoroughly as Chris alluded to it, right? I think for decades there were basically people who did this for a living, who looked at metrics and created something that was called a brand and athlete fit, right? To make sure that the two complement each other. To be honest, Chris, I don't know whether these models, which I was a big fan of because they give you something to work with, whether they are still valid. And the reason why I wonder whether they are still valid is the speed and how incredibly fast-lived our society is these days.
I think it's one thing that may have changed over time is the sort of the size of the brand of the person. And I think that this is the there was Last Dance is a documentary on Netflix that was out a couple of years ago. It talks about Michael Jordan, and Michael Jordan was a massive personality, bigger than we're used to. And you sort of, I think, as these brands, and sports is it's a great area for this because it does rely traditionally on massive sponsorship, and there's all sorts of stuff going on there. But you get like a Colin Kaepernick, for example, you're no longer a quarterback, you're a human being, and you have political views. And what I thought was quite interesting, and I'm not going to make this all about golf, but Tiger Woods' scandals of extramarital affairs and everything, when that came out, I think it wasn't necessarily the scandalousness of the behavior. It was just that it was so different from the brand. So the Tiger Woods who's sponsoring Nike and Deloitte, and he had all sorts of, and I heard someone say like, hey, like John Daly drinks on the golf course and gambles, and that's sort of part of his brand. And that's okay. And he has sponsorships, but you're sort of limited because there's a sort of a flawed human being there. But I think in some of these sponsorships, you get people who are that maybe they're held to a high standard, or it's just you can't be a brand without being a person with preferences, with political orientations, with opinions. So I think that there's an attempt to kind of, I don't know. I think it's just the dynamic's different. Go ahead, Jesse.
I think you're hitting it on the nose. I think it depends on the brand. And I think what we ask of brands is what we ask of any story, what we ask of any entertainment, and that's coherence. Right? When the brand becomes incoherent, all of a sudden you're going to tune out. And what happened with Tiger Woods was fraud. Right? His brand previous to that moment was fraudulent. Right? He was selling an image, he was selling an identity which was false. And what happened was that house of cards fell apart. It cost him, he could have been a trillionaire, right?
It didn't cost him Nike.
No, but here's the thing. He could have been a trillionaire. And here's, let me just reiterate something, because I think golf is going to dominate this episode. And I think for good reason. Golf sponsorship is the epitome of power, politics, and money, right? Like golf, unlike almost any other sports, Formula One is kind of on the same scale, right? As is World Cup. But golf is something that happens every week, and it targets the wealthy and it targets the ruling elite. And this is where I'll say Tiger Woods did blow it. He's still a billionaire, but he could have been the world's first trillionaire. That was the empire that was being built up around him, and it fell apart. Versus John Daly is John Daly, right? And people like it for who he is. But I think, to go back to Jan's point about the ethics of sport, that is the ultimate paradox here. Because on the one hand, people love sports and they follow sports precisely because there's rules and there is an out of bounds. It is the only part of life in which there are rules and out of bounds. Everything else in life, it's kind of shit just gets made up, even the court of law. But sports is the only temple in which rules and out of bounds exist, which is why it is such a paradox that the sponsorship of sports is so unethical.
But then there is sports betting, which gets the bad guys in again, right? To break all the rules and bring the dirt back into the ecosystem, so to say.
Which is happening, it's flourishing right now. Like the impact of gambling on sports, the impact of gambling on sports media is so huge right now because of the sponsorship by casinos and bookies. To your point, Jan, it threatens the purity of the game in terms of the belief that the rules and fair. You've been trying to jump in, Chris, please.
Well, I think, and even just if you're to sustain the model, like the broadcast media area of, okay, we want to pay quality people to provide insight and have these high quality broadcasts. You need the advertising revenue, right? And right now, a lot of that is coming from legalized betting.
Yeah.
And you're sort of like, well, we don't like it, and we see the problems with it, but we really need the money to do this. And I just, on your you had your 3 Ps of golf. Was it power,
politics? I forget what the third one was. Politics.
I don't think it was privilege, but I was going to add privilege into that.
Sure.
And Formula One is probably the same way. But I think this is where you get back to sort of the sponsorship area. You are your brand is influenced by the brands you attach yourself to, right? Like that. So we're seeing that more. And are you willing to take it on the chin for a less than stellar endorsement? Like, I don't know, and try to like find a stellar endorsement. Like everybody has got, well, what about what they're doing, right? It's hard to no one's squeaky clean in any of this.
But you don't need to be. That's the John Daly point. That if you start off not being squeaky clean, that's your brand, right? And as long as you're coherent with that, and to your point, I mean, Jan, can you think of any rebels, any people who, you know, we, as Chris was sort of inferring, we might think of as unsponsorable, who have been successful in this world of sponsorship, in this world of brand endorsement, brand sponsorship, brand association? You know, who are the renegades who have survived or have built a business in that regard, other than Joe Rogan? And I don't think Joe Rogan is aligned with anyone other than Spotify right now.
To be honest, I really can't think of anyone. I mean, there is the one or the other, athlete in a niche sport such as ultra running who has a sponsorship of an Italian running brand that you've never heard of. But I cannot think of someone who is unsponsorable and then got a really bold partner by their side who said, no, we stand by them and we take the stance here.
Yeah. Because that illustrates your earlier hypocrisy or double standard, right? That on the one hand, we treat these relationships as political. We treat these relationships as, desiring authenticity, but it's no surprise. It's all a show, right? It's all a construct.
I mean, we briefly spoke about Tiger Woods earlier. And you made that really strong point, Jesse, that he blew it and that he could have been the first trillionaire, but now isn't. I was really tempted to say that I disagree, that he might not have blown it, but that in my opinion, this whole thing has humanized him. Just think of the fact that he is basically the same generation as Derek Jeter, right? Both are Nike-sponsored athletes. There's nothing more boring to listen to than a Derek Jeter interview because he went through all these Nike trainings. So did Tiger Woods. Yeah. And what we got from both of them were robotic deliveries and the right answers to simply every single question. Yeah. And I would argue that this might have saved Tiger Woods, the coming clean. And didn't he then win a major for the first time in 2 decades just recently after all this even happened?
Yes, he won the Masters, Jan. That was
sorry.
But I think it creates.
I'm your guy for football and
it
soccer.
Creates a new story. It creates a new narrative, and I think this is part of the Nike hanging on to. And I think part of their explanation was, we are standing by our guy, and I think forgiveness is a great trait. But he now has a whole new brand that he maybe lost control of, but I think he's regained control of it. I'm just going to throw 2 names out of sort of like disgraced people. Ben Johnson showed up in an ad for some power drink.
Yes.
And so he's not building an empire around that.
No.
The other one that I think was is I haven't heard of for a while, but I'm sure he's doing just fine. Thank you very much. Is Lance Armstrong.
Yes.
And you're out, and it
So
becomes
I'm glad.
different.
I'm glad you brought up Lance Armstrong, and only because I think he owned his brand, right? Like, I think his brand was something that he had before, his steroid scandal. And I think it allowed that brand to stay true to who he was. Because I think, just like Ben Johnson, a lot of people felt like, it was good that Lance Armstrong cheated. The same way I think it was good that Ben Johnson cheated, because everyone in that 100-meter race with Ben Johnson was doping, and Ben Johnson was the one who got caught. But to your point, I think if there was, so the reason I asked, about the rebels, the punks, is I'm trying to hypothesize whether, if we had a real open and transparent market, whether we would have a different character of sponsorship that wasn't so sterile. And I'll give two examples. The first is that service Cameo, right? So Cameo is this kind of social media service that allows you to pay a celebrity $500 to do like a birthday greeting for your friend, right? And I would love to see their metrics, because I bet you that, so Pete Rose, for example, Pete Rose, the baseball great, I've always been a Pete Rose fan, and I think it's ludicrous that Pete Rose was banned from baseball. And I bet if there was an open market in which people could pay Pete Rose a la Cameo, that he would be quite popular, and that there are other people who are like that. So what if, and here I'm hypothesizing, what if the current sponsorship market is centralized? Right? There's agencies, there's brands, right? There's ways in which it's limited. But now, thanks to social media, the sponsorship market's being decentralized. That even small businesses can start sponsoring small local influencers, and anyone who has a decent following can themselves earn sponsorship. So perhaps what we're seeing is a seismic shift in terms of how sponsorship works that is going to allow for different voices, different identities to get paid as part of their reputation, as part of the trust that they've engendered with their followers, that would lead to a more diverse, a more colorful, a more human, a more flawed version of spokesperson than the one, historically we've seen as part of the larger media ecosystem.
As you spoke, two examples came to my mind, Jesse. One is a former British prisoner who now lives in France. His name is Johnny McAvoy, I think. While in prison, he basically broke all world records on a stationary rowing machine. And he is now, out of prison and is a Nike-sponsored triathlete. He is not winning any races, and in terms of age, you could also say that he is by now in the early fall of his career. But it's basically his being a misfit, his life turnaround, Phoenix from the flame story that Nike and other sponsors have bought into. And the other example that came to mind is a really interesting one. Novo Nordisk, the European pharmaceutical manufacturer, is sponsoring a cycling team, which is the first and only professional cycling team that consists exclusively out of diabetic patients. So in terms of someone who's unsponsorable, right, he is a pharmaceutical company that takes intentionally people who are supposedly not able to even practice the sport and supports them practicing that sport professionally at the elite
That's
level.
Fantastic. Right on.
Yeah.
And Chris, you should keep yourself unmuted only because it makes it easier for you to jump in. Go ahead.
And then I think, Jesse, when you're talking about, I think that the sponsorship sort of area, and I like your point about it sort of becoming more transparent. It just it allows people to, like, it contributes to their livelihood or to their just general wealth. And I think when you were talking about sort of these, whether it's a Pete Rose or a Barry Bonds, or these sort of famous but sort of disgraced people. I suspect that there's a speaker circuit for those people, and someone's going to pay them, like, and we won't know about it, but some, like, is it a Rotary Club or somebody is going to have Pete Rose come, and he's gonna give us like Pete Rose Unplugged. And I think that those speaking circuits, I think they can be tens or hundreds of $1,000s to get someone to spend the evening with you. And hey, you tee up a half dozen of those, and maybe you're doing okay, right? Like, you don't have the Nike sponsorship, but you're still able to sort of do what you do and exist in your infamy rather than your fame.
Well, and the two things we haven't touched upon yet that I want to sort of dig into is self-sponsorship, which effectively is Patreon, right? Where it's not that it's your money sponsoring yourself, but you are the one mobilizing the sponsorship campaign for yourself. And you're crowdsourcing that sponsorship, which of course for many people is very effective, even if it's just a few $100 a month, right? Like, it doesn't have to be, you know, a hugely substantive. But then the other side is automated sponsorship. And this is the other social media model. And this was, you know, the latest example of this, of course, is Twitter, and the way in which that Twitter is kind of leaning hard right, kind of by design. And the remaining sponsors who are part of that site are finding themselves disappointingly or shocked that they're sponsoring like fascist content and extreme right content, which is the obvious danger of automated sponsorship. But at the same time, I think it's worth acknowledging the appeal of automated sponsorship for both sides, and why that continues to be a phenomena unto itself in terms of the internet, with all the perils and dangers that come with it.
We're thinking moving the personal brand out of the sports realm and into the business realm. Elon Musk has a personal brand that's very much like, here's what I am, here's what I do. And it's interesting that people are still attaching themselves to that. Like, nobody noticed, but I left Twitter. Nobody noticed, but staying there has consequences. And are those consequences, oh, hey, great, finally a company that's not being hypocritical and they're just happy to go where the eyeballs are unapologetically? Okay, cool. Or is it, what? My banner ad or whatever is showing up beside this horrendous content. Our corporate brand can't handle that. And I think there's just very, very different ways to understand that. And I think back to sort of the beating drum reality of many businesses just need to get in front of eyeballs and maybe are happy to take a reputational hit in order to get in front of those eyeballs, right?
Well,
like, I don't know.
And to your point, I'm sure Twitter ads are pretty cheap right now, right?
Except
like
for the sports betting people, they're paying at a premium.
but you know, according to supply and demand, Twitter ads would be a huge bargain, especially for a small business.
Absolutely.
Although, to your other point, I'm sure that Twitter did notice when you left Twitter. Only in the aggregate, but nonetheless.
Hey, can I offer another hypothesis here, or even a provocation? You know, my hypothesis would be that this discussion about ads around ultra-right content, yes or not, is it damaging or not? I would argue that is a discussion that is exclusively being had between media people, people who are in charge of content at X, and the people who shell out the advertising dollars. But I would argue that no consumer ever said, oh, I saw a Pepsi ad next to the tweet that read X, Y, and Z.
I don't know about that.
Pepsi, how can you, right?
Yeah.
So I think it is an important discussion, and probably more important about why are the controls that are supposed to be in place not working, coincidence or plan. But I'm not sure how relevant that is for the public.
So let me both agree and disagree, and then Chris, you follow up. I do agree with you that I think that this is kind of specialists only, kind of inside baseball. But at the same time, I think more and more people are becoming politicized often by conspiracy, around the products they buy and who they buy it from. I don't think they realize how centralized most industries are and how like a single company will own 24 brands. Yep. But I do, to where I agree with you here, and I'm not changing subjects, Chris, so by all means, respond to what Jan said. But I think to what you said, the similarity here is Saudi Arabia. Because I think a lot of people get up in arms about Saudi Arabia sponsoring sports events and throwing their money around. And the phrase that's often used in the media is sports washing, right? That they're using sports to, upgrade their reputation. And I don't think that's the case at all. I think Saudi Arabia doesn't care what the rest of the world thinks. I think MBS in particular wants everyone to know that he ordered the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, because he is that kind of a goon. And I think that they see this largely as like tourism, right? And marketing as to why people should come and watch sports and watch wrestling and watch all these events in Saudi Arabia. So I agree with you that there's a kind of a literati of people in the media and advertising who talk about this stuff, and most people don't care. But at the flip side, I think people are becoming politicized, often for the wrong reasons. And that is also starting to influence how they perceive brands and sponsorship and what else. Sorry, Chris, go ahead.
No, it's I think what Eminem says, there's no such thing as bad PR, right? Like that's the I think there's an individual. So I was going to say, I don't think you're giving the average consumer credit. I think that people do. I think people are thoughtful about the choices they make, and they have lots of choices. And in order to do that, I think there is an emotional attachment, and maybe you do care. And there's right, like, so where are the ads showing up, and maybe it's enough to steer you from Coke to Pepsi or whatever. And I think to Jesse's point, I think there's also an increasing sort of team dynamic to this, where you're not ordering a light beer, you're making a statement, right? And and I think that those are like real consequences to business beyond the inside baseball of where you go. I absolutely, I hope those conversations are happening. I'd be very curious as people run the numbers, right? Because you're having to quantify, hey, if we do this, we're associating ourselves with this kind of content, right? We don't know clearly what the consequences of that are, right? But if we don't do this, here's the reach of our product, that like we're not getting this exposure that we're used to getting. And then someone's going to have to say, keep doing it, or you know what, we won't. So I think it's a fascinating context for a important decision under loads of ambiguity. But I will come back and say, I'm not sure that you're giving the average consumer enough credit.
My question here would be, right, would advertisers need more information about the advertising content, or don't have advertisers seen sufficient evidence by now that obviously Twitter X is a very right wing market square, whatever you want to call it? I mean, if I know that a certain city is a certain way, then I'm not going there.
Mm-hmm.
And do they miss you? Because there are other people going to go there because it's that way.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Right.
So I am conscious of time, and I want to start wrapping this up. And I say this because I'm now about to open the hornet's nest, which is Israel, right? Because, on the one hand, I brought up South Africa and apartheid and the effectiveness of the BDS movement, the boycott, divest, sanctions movement that targeted South Africa quite successfully and helped topple the apartheid regime. And activists, anti-Zionist activists, Free Palestinian activists have been engaged in a similar BDS movement against Israel for years. And many people here in Canada and around the world have charged that this boycott campaign is anti-Semitic, which I don't think it is. I think that's an absolutely ludicrous charge. I think, boycotts are perfectly legitimate means of democratic protest and democratic dissent. And there's nothing wrong with people saying, don't buy these products because, it supports these politics or supports these ideologies. but I think, moving forward, we're going to see an expansion of that type of boycott activity, especially because of how political the conflict in Gaza and Israel is. But I bring this up because I am the kind of person who thought, well, Israel, I'm not going to Israel. No way. Like, that's not the kind of place that I want to hang out. It's not the vibe for me. So, I wanted to throw that in there because I think moving forward, sponsorship around Israel, around Palestine, is going to be something that really intersects politics and business in a very complicated way.
I think that on the potentially with the brand and even the sloganeering area, what was I'm thinking of the slogan and the hashtag that came around, Me Too, like that. And then there was the Je suis, what was the magazine that was attacked? It wasn't Je suis Henri, but it was Je suis whatever that is. But I was very surprised. I guess I shouldn't have been surprised. I noted that on LinkedIn, I stand with Israel was a slogan that was popping up, and you can guess the comments that followed that, right? And it's just there's such nuance to that it can't be bumper stickered. And I think the attempt to make a clear, you mentioned earlier, it's a clear, compelling story. How can you say this in a hashtag? What's your elevator pitch? It doesn't work. And I think it works at your peril, because you wade into the hornet's nest of, oh, well, if you stand with Israel, that must mean this, 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 and this. And then just ensues the shitstorm of hot take conversations that, to Jan's point, drives the eyeballs that see the ads that buy the products.
So as you were talking, Chris, I thought, I stand with Israel, brought to you by Pepsi, right? That is really, really cringeworthy. You can't do that. But then on the other hand, what was the initiative a couple of years ago that Bono was involved in this Red campaign? What was it?
He's been involved in a lot.
Not AIDS.
I thought
no. It was this Red movement or campaign.
Funny how we can't remember it at all.
T-shirts that's red, Inspire Red, and then in brackets red, and the proceeds of that thing went.
I remember it, but I have no idea what it stood for.
I don't know either.
I think it was AIDS related.
I don't know either, but what I know is it was big, and it was a conglomerate of sponsors or companies that stood behind that, right? And I think as soon as it is a community of sponsors and not something that is as cringeworthy as brought to you by Pepsi, right? Then the whole thing becomes more tolerable, and you could basically accept, okay, Goldman Sachs have shelled out a couple of millions here in order to help promote a cause and not necessarily tie their name in an exploiting way to something.
Yeah. Well, and climate change, I think, has provided that similar kind of platform building where it allows, British Petroleum to call themselves Beyond Petroleum, right? Or, allows some of the greatest polluters to say that they're doing something as well, which I'm not disparaging. I mean, if we create an opportunity for the biggest polluters to actually help address the problems they've created, that is a positive. But Chris, to your point, you would think that the words Free Palestine are pretty straightforward, right? Like, you would think that we have come to a point in the 21st century where we recognize that colonization is bad, that imperialism isn't really the right thing, and that allowing people to have self-determination is like a basic human right. But I can't say Free Palestine publicly, even though I do support that position, because it is so easily appropriated into a much more twisted and convoluted dialogue.
Yes.
If I may say one more thing here, Jesse, and then I'll throw this back to you here, because I'll refer to something that you shared with me yesterday. I think in order to, I like the idea of, moving sponsorship away from musicians or actors or athletes onto something that is a little more meaningful, right? But the question is, how do you achieve that as long as people still flock to Travis Kelce and Taylor Swift. I wonder when I will stop referring to the two of them as an example in everything that I say, basically.
Well, when their time in the sun fades, and it hasn't yet. But
No,
please
it has
continue.
not yet. But so, you won't need the cause to be sexy or interesting, right? And for people to pay attention. And you know what came to mind, Jesse? That TikTok video that you sent to me yesterday with that actress who, did the
She's
presentation.
in Good Omens. She's amazing in Good Omens.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
That was so much fun to watch. I almost dove into my phone. Right.
Yes.
And this is when this becomes interesting. And if a film like that would end with brought to you by Patagonia, I would say bravo.
Yes. And so, Chris, this was a beautiful British satire of sort of the oil industry speaking truth, right? But it was so well done that it just, as Jan pointed out, it draws you in like great drama does. And if that was sponsored content, I agree. I think it would have been fantastic. But to your point, or I think the point you were making is there's rarely that kind of courage. There is rarely that kind of chutzpah in the world of sponsorship in terms of dealing, and we need that. We should have that. I think the brands who are able to do that are going to win, hands down. But here, allow me to your Travis and Taylor line. Allow me to throw out a crazy socialist idea, which I will introduce the original and then I'll introduce the adaptation.
Aren't those the same things? Crazy and socialist?
Not necessarily, but they can.
I'm joking.
Maximum income. Like, what if we said you can make $100 million, but everything past that is subject to 100% tax rate, and that's it. You can't make any more. So what if we said maximum sponsorship income, right? Any single individual can only make $50 million, $10 million, right? Which all of a sudden means the Travises and the Taylors would max out pretty quick, and there would be room for a whole bunch of other people.
Or you give them the responsibility to find a worthy recipient. So they have to find and support the next person. Like, I don't know.
Yeah, but that would be a cult. Who knows? I agree.
Crazy socialist, potato.
Yeah, I had to throw the cult word in just so that we could have consecutive podcast episodes. But
I think this is a really, really good suggestion, Jesse, because I think this could also help rebalance or reshift the weight in sports a little bit, right? Yeah. If you think of both soccer and golf, right? Who were the first ones to jump ship and go over there and play? The ones that had the most money and needed money the least, right? So if there was this cap, then needy second tier or third tier players might be able to benefit. And Cristiano Ronaldo would still be playing in Europe.
Go ahead, Chris.
No, I think we've explored, I think, Jesse, you were talking about sort of the chutzpah and the sort of like the inspiring and like authentic, like, here's what we stand for, which I think is a nice positive thing. I wanted to, and I know you're sensitive to time, but just ending on like, how bad do you have to be before where you can no longer play in this game? I don't know that we'll see any sponsorship by the Purdue pharmaceutical company. I don't know. I do know, and this is just through, this is a guy that I play golf with, was that he was in the States for a friend of his was getting married, kind of like a club, and they had the reception in the Sackler room. And you sort of like, at what point does a legacy that had some good to it, right? Like the world is not black and white, but at what point does it become like so toxic that no one will take the money?
Yeah.
And I think I don't know that I've seen an example that's so toxic that no one will take the money.
Well, and just to be clear, I will always take the money. To anyone listening right now who would like to sponsor the Echopunks,
we need a sponsor for this.
We will launder anyone's money because I fundamentally believe that in dealing with us, they will start to do good. that is how transformative the EchoPunks are. And that's why I talk about courage in sponsorship. And it brings us back to where we started about sponsor and sponsee and who sort of has responsibility, and it's fluid. The one thing we haven't talked about, which we're not going to talk about because I think we should start to come to an end, is sponsorship of academics. Right? And the way in which universities aren't just sponsored for sports, they're often sponsored for policy, right? This is what Google does. This is what Amazon does. Facebook does this. They basically pay universities to help churn out research that says they are great, the way that cigarette companies used to churn out research that says that cigarettes are healthy. And that is obviously a huge ethical quandrum and policy. But I don't want to have that conversation today because I want fellow EchoPunk Vasiliki Bednar to participate because she is a very, very animate about that subject and has a bunch of different ideas around policies. But any final words, closing thoughts around the issue of sponsorship and where you think it's headed? So why don't we do that? Why don't we do one last go around? We'll start with you, Jan. What do you think the future of sponsorship is? Both based on our conversation today and based on whatever crazy ideas spontaneously come into your head.
I think the future of sponsorship is philanthropy. Due to for the lack of a better term, bigger shine, brighter halo that it has, and also due to what I would perceive as stronger scrutiny that you can apply to a philanthropic engagement versus, right, if you sponsor a basketball team, who knows what they do tomorrow night in Vegas.
Right on.
All right, there we go.
Chris, what do you think the future of sponsorship is?
Yeah, so I think this is going on, and Jan, I love your word, the scrutiny. I think there's I hope a more critical look at the connections we're making and whether they're fits and whether they're okay. And I think the world. What they say, sunlight's the best disinfectant. Like if these relationships are above board that everybody can talk about. It brings a level of scrutiny that I think is useful and serves many purposes, even if those purposes are divergent. I don't know if that made sense.
Right on. Well, I think I'll do for mine that the future of sponsorship is a communal, collectivized. Because I think you said something interesting, Jan, about how when big brands get together, there's, a lot of power, a lot of momentum to that. And I would imagine that happening amongst small businesses, right? Like imagine, and this has actually happened here in Canada, where like the Saskatchewan Roughriders, the CFL football team, is owned by the community. Right. And there's ways I think that the internet can allow for that kind of aggregation, can allow for smaller players to pool their funds and be able to sponsor something they love, whether that's a team, whether that's an event, whether that's, a concert or a festival. And I think there's definitely a lot of potential there. So with that said, sorry, you wanted to jump in there, Jan. Go ahead.
Yes, I didn't want to, but you just said athlete or sponsoree or sponsee do whatever they want. That might be the topic for another podcast. But what I find super interesting are athletes in whatever sport they are in, right? Basically looking at their sport and then saying, okay, let me develop my own shoe brand, or let me develop, product X. So, if the athlete basically take their equity and say, okay, I'm going to bring that into the sport, that's what I find interesting too.
Right on. I think this has been a fantastic discussion. Our audience here clearly agrees. I think to your point, Jan, imagine if each professional team provided an incubator to allow their athletes to develop their own businesses. That would be crazy.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's it. We'll see you guys again soon. Thanks everyone for listening. EchoPunks.live on the web, and Google Echopunks to find us elsewhere. All right. Thanks
Thank
again.
you. Have a wonderful one.
Awesome.
Take care. Bye bye.